What a horrible nightmare. I saw that everything around me was destroyed.
Spooky's Adventure, aka Story 1, was originally created back in 2014, the same time at the end of my 7th grade year when I was in middle school, so I'm going to start from there. The plot for the story is actually pretty similar to the original. Of course, there were some changes made, with some being bigger than others. Originally, the story was going to be a video game. When I was in 7th grade, right before summer break, my group of friends decided that we should try and come up with the plot for a video game, seeing as how one of them knew someone that could program. Immediately, me and one of my friends began working on a plot. Ghosts came up for some random reason. I don't really remember exactly why that is, but it happened, and we rolled with it. If I had to make a guess, I'm going to assume it's because I used to watch, and still occasionally watch, ghost shows. But regardless, the original plot of the game went something like this. Humans and ghosts were the best of friends. One day, the magical sphere that gave ghosts their powers was shattered. Ghosts, blaming the humans, began to fight, and humans, defending themselves, fought back. Spooky and his human friend were the only two that knew something bad was happening. An evil force had broken this sphere. So, the two of them set out to fix the magical sphere and stop the war. When I shared this plot with one of the head people in my friend group, it was rejected for sounding too much like a Kirby game. Side note, I was very obsessed with Kirby at the time, but this was not at all my intention. Looking back though, I can see why this story was compared with Kirby, though that's a story for another day. Refusing to give up, my one friend and I continued working on this story regardless. However, once we all got to the 8th grade, the hype about creating a game kind of just faded away. Even my one friend stopped working on it as much, and so did I. School had become more difficult, at least for me, and took more of my time. It was later that school year, though, when I decided to pick the project back up again. When I did, I changed the story a bit and even added more to it. Before jumping into information about the characters, I'm going to go over the different areas. Now, my friend and I worked on different areas, so I don't really know how much she got done with her part. We originally came up with at least 3 different areas: a forest, a haunted mansion, and a castle. I worked on the haunted mansion while she worked on the forest. With the haunted mansion, I came up with the boss and mechanic that was special to this area alone, being a flashlight. I also named this area, or back in the original plot level 2, which was named Cursed Manor. That was pretty much all I had created when I thought we could make an area with ice. At the time, I thought it could be mountains, but that was changed to be a palace of ice instead. The castle was just that, a castle, and it was also decided that this is the place where the final boss would reside. I thought we should have another area because just 4 seemed too short of a game, but we never came up with the 5th area when originally working on the project. Years later, however, I came up with the idea for a desert, which was named Screeching Desert, and I also took over the forest area, being named Haunted Forest. Town was created later on as a place where the player could buy items, as well as Flo's Forest, which acted as the game's hub. The only area that ever got artwork back then was Cursed Manor, but in order to hype up for the release of Spooky's Adventure, I did various drawings of the main characters in all of these new areas. The first character that was created for this series was Spooky. My friend was the one that actually created and named him. I just redesigned him. As the years went on, I redesigned him more and more until Spooky looks like he does now. Focusing on his original design, he did still have horns, they just looked really weird. I never did color him. I always drew him with pencils, so as for an original color scheme, he never really had one in the first place. The only other characters that are from the original story is Penumbra, Snowblade, and the 3 Flames. Seeing as how I made Penumbra second, I'll go ahead and start off with him. When I first created him, his name was going to be either the Stalking Shadow or the Stalking Phantom. When I created a character named Phantom, I settled on the name the Stalking Shadow. The reason why I gave him this name was because in the game, he would follow the player, or Spooky, throughout Cursed Manor, the level he resided in. After I realized how dumb that name sounded, I did some research on shadowy names and stumbled upon the word penumbra. As for design, the only part that really changed was his arms. They were going to be all squiggly for some reason, but I decided to make them actual functioning arms for obvious reasons. Moving on to Snowblade, he was originally going to be this giant snowflake monster thing, but I didn't really like that design, so I scrapped him. After about a year or years, I can't remember exactly how long, I redesigned him to look like the Snowblade that exists now. Seeing as how this was a game, yes, both of these villains did, and still do, have sort of attack patterns. Penumbra being able to manipulate shadows, and Snowblade being able to control ice. When originally working on this project, my friend suggested that the final boss of this game should be a dragon. I liked this idea, but seeing as how I couldn't really draw dragons at the time, I drew concept art for a different final boss. I didn't really like his design, and neither did my friend, so he was scrapped. A few years later, I remembered my friend's idea for a dragon final boss and created Midnight. Her design changed slightly over the first year of her existence, but now her design is finalized. The Three Flames, which were and still are the rivals of Spooky, or the annoying guys getting in the way, whichever you'd prefer to call them, originally had a small flame on their heads and oval arms with no fingers. Around the time when I redesigned Snowblade, I redesigned the three as well as gave them their individual names. I know there may be confusion as to why Cherise acts like the leader of the group instead of Cobalt, seeing as how Cobalt has blue flames and blue fire is hotter than red fire, but the reason I did this was because in the original game, Cherise was going to insult Cobalt by calling him a water ghost. Dumb, I know, which is why I scrapped that line, but I kept Cherise as the leader anyway. As for Creepiary and Conservator, they were the two newest additions to the Spooky's Adventure cast. Creepiary was the boss of the Haunted Forest, and Conservator was the boss of Screeching Desert. Conservator was originally going to have chains incorporated in his design, but I didn't really know how to draw chains, so I gave him scarves instead. Now, I have recently drawn Conservator with chains, and I also realized that drawing Conservator over and over again would have been very difficult, and animating him as well. Yeah, no, I'm keeping his scarves. Also, Conservator was going to originally be a more nervous character. That has changed as well. The basic enemies such as Winged Spook and Prickly were created after the plot and main cast was finalized, the same being said for the mini-bosses and residents of town. Back when Spooky's Adventure was going to be a game, the player, or Spooky, was actually going to gain powers with the various sphere shards that were collected. Now, most of these never received concept art and were just written down, but this idea was scrapped very early on anyway. Some of these powers included flight, invisibility, shapeshifting, possession, phasing through solid surfaces, and shooting lasers for some reason. In the final version of Spooky's Adventure, I decided to have Spooky remain powerless, apart from him being able to do the abilities that all ghosts can do, as to try and make him a more relatable character. In addition, there are a handful of scrapped characters, including enemies, some of which were redesigned, but others just didn't make it. The humans, including Spooky's human friend, were also scrapped, mainly because I didn't really know how to draw humans at the time. That seems to be a reoccurring theme. At some point, Spooky also had a sister, Spookette. My friend came up with her as well, but Spookette was also scrapped, seeing as how she wouldn't have that much to do with the plot. However, rather recently, with the making of a third series of mine, Universal Clash, Spookette has returned. In short, Universal Clash has brought forth various AUs of both of my book series, including Spooky Stories. She does not appear in Spooky Stories, nor do I have plans for her appearing in Universal Clash, but she is canon now. The big difference being that she is no longer Spooky's sister, but a gender-bent AU of Spooky. And the humans do make a comeback as well, however, they do not appear in the main series of spooky stories, rather they appear in the origin stories. While I was in the 8th grade, I took a class about coding. This was when I found out how difficult it is, at least in my opinion, and that was also in 8th grade, so it's been a pretty good while, so I probably have a big brain now compared to back then. And so I decided to make Spooky's Adventure, as well as the other stories I would create in the near future, animated movies. I love to draw and wanted to be an animator, so I thought this would be perfect. And so my search for animation software began. I found various animation software, but none really stood out to me to work on such a large project. Instead, I would do shorter animations as sort of tests. After about a year of this, I discovered that this idea wasn't going to work either. I was the only one left still working on this project, and it would take years and lots of my energy in order to get all of these stories turned into full animated movies. For a while, I had given up, when my mom suggested that I write down my ideas. That's when it hit me. I could write a book. No, multiple books! When making my stories into books, many changes had to be done. I had to flesh out these worlds and characters a lot more than I originally did, and Spooky's Adventure was the one that had the most changes done. For those that have read it, the resemblance of a video game is still there, being the 4 main bosses, Creepiary, Penumbra, Snowblade, and Conservator, the main areas, Haunted Forest, Cursed Manor, Snowblade's Palace, Screeching Desert, Castle of the Forgotten, Town, and Flo's Forest, and the collectibles, Sphere Shards. Just because these stories are in book format doesn't mean that I don't draw or animate my characters anymore. Heck, I can't wait for the day to come when I can make my stories into animated movies. For now, though, I'm happy that I finally get to share these stories, including the one that I began to make in 2014.